Carolyn Bardo, what got you interested in writing a book about Ross Perot?
Well, I live in Dallas, and I've been a journalist in Dallas for 28 years, and so Ross Perot has been right there in my backyard. So I guess I knew what a fascinating character he was, and I've also covered politics. And it seemed to me that he had the potential to change American politics, and that he was tapping a chord out there that politicians in recent years had not tapped. So I just sensed that there was something going on there in American politics that ought to be paid attention to.
When did you first ever meet him?
Oh, gee. I guess back in the late 60s, I was covering City Hall in Dallas, and he came in for a zoning change on a piece of property to build EDS. And I was covering that, and at the time, he sort of an indication of the kind of guy he would become, or already was, I guess, and he threatened the city of Dallas that if you don't let me have my zoning change for EDS to build my campus right here, I'll move out of Dallas and move to the suburbs.
Did it work?
Yeah, he got it. Yeah.
Have you had much to do with him, one-on-one?
Not really. I mean, I've been acquainted with him over the years, and I was aware of his work when he was, and did some coverage of when he was appointed to head a statewide task force on public education reform in Texas, and dealt with him a little bit there. And also when he also served as head of a statewide task force on drugs in Texas. And so I was just aware of what he was doing in business, and from time to time his name would come up. People would say, well, Ross Perot ought to run for Senate, or he ought to run for governor, or this or that, you know. And he would always say, you know, no, I'm not temperamentally suited for politics. I don't want to be in elective office. I want to be, you know, behind the scenes.
You thanked Sharon Holman early in this book.
Yeah.
Who is she?
Well, Sharon Holman is his, I guess today she's his press spokesman, his communications director, and she was the person who was working with the press along with Jim Squires early in the '92 presidential campaign. And actually, I went out to do a column on the Perot petition drive in the spring of '92. It was probably early April or so, and started talking to people who were trying to circulate the petitions. And I was just I was struck with the passion of the people who were involved in this movement. And so I went out to talk to Sharon Holman about writing this book. And I was also interested because I knew that Perot had this mastery of high technology, and he was talking about using the communications revolution. Of course, he had his own money. He could put whatever money he wanted to into it. It just seemed like a unique combination of factors there, and I thought it would make a book. So I went out to talk to Sharon Holman about it, and she said, fax me a list of everybody you want to interview, and I'll get it over to Mr. Perot. And so I sent her a list of everybody I wanted to interview. Mostly they were people working in the campaign, and the leaders in the campaign. And she called back and said, Mr. Perot said no to all of your interview requests. And she said, he said to tell you to go out and talk to the volunteers. So I later said that Sharon Holman did me a real favor, because I went out and started talking to volunteers and spent 3 months actually talking with people around the country who were interested in this Perot phenomenon. And I think that really is the guts of the story.
Why did he say no?
Well, I don't know. He just, you know, he's not one to cooperate with the press at all anyway. And I don't think he wanted a book written that he did not commission himself. I just, you know, think that's just probably the way Perot is.
Did he talk to you?
He did eventually, yeah. Mm-hmm.
How long?
I finally got a real interview with him, I guess, a few days before the book was scheduled to go to the printer for about, I don't know, an hour or two. And I had run into him and talked to him, you know, just little spot interviews. But actually, I pretty much decided that I wasn't going to get very much from Perot anyway, that he wasn't saying on TV, on the talk shows, that he wasn't going to reveal any secrets to me. So most of the story, I think the political story, came from the people who were supporting Perot and those who were involved in the campaign actually working for him.
Recount the story of the woman in Dallas who was taking calls right after all this started In other words, they were calling. I think you mentioned that Sally Bell, Mr. Perot's secretary, was getting calls, and finally this woman kept calling up and saying, "Transfer them over to me." Who was that woman?
Well, she was just a woman in Dallas. She managed an apartment complex there. Her name was Judy Follett, and she kept calling Sally Bell, the secretary, and finally, and Sally Bell was saying, "We don't know what we're going to do with all these calls, all these callers since Larry King." And Judy said, "Well, give them my number." And so she did. And of course, she said her message machine filled up immediately, and she could not handle all the calls. I mean, it was just overwhelming. And so after a day or two, they quit giving out her number. But it was just mushrooming so fast. Judy Follett went on to try to get some petitions to find out how do you get on the ballot in Texas, and where do you get the petitions, how to get the petitions out. And she, in fact, mailed out petitions all over the state. She finally put on her message machine, don't call, just leave your name and address, and we'll try to get some petitions to you.
This is back in February.
She eventually dropped out. I don't know what ever happened to her, but she was not. I didn't run into her, in the fall at all.
We go back to the beginning. That was in February of 1992, and Ross Perot's office, his secretary, overwhelming amount of calls, just transferred the number to somebody they didn't even know.
Yeah. Well, it didn't transfer.
I mean, just gave the
number out. And but the calls kept coming in to the Perot's office because people didn't know where else to call, and so they were calling Dallas to find out, how could they call, Perot. So the calls continued to come in, and eventually, I've forgotten what the time period was now. After a week or two, Perot said, "Look, we've got to do something about these calls," and so he called in 6 people who were part of his business staff and said, "Do what you can to set up a phone bank to handle these incoming calls." And very quickly thereafter, then, that team of 6, volunteers started coming in. They started answering the phones, and they started feeding the information back out, and it sort of just went from there.
What are the 2 or 3 things that you learned? We can go into detail on them later, but 2 or 3 things you learned from talking to the volunteers that might have surprised you?
Well, I don't know if it was a surprise or not, but I think the main thing that I learned was that there was such a deep-seated alienation out there of people from their government. And I think it was something that other politicians were not aware of or were not paying attention to. And, over the process of the campaign, Perot was, repeatedly called crazy or whatever. Well, he wasn't crazy at all, because I think he was prescient enough to recognize the alienation that was out there of the people from their government. They were tired of being taken for granted, of being treated condescendingly, and I think it was an opportunity for them to get involved, people who had felt powerless to affect politics, to change politics. And all of a sudden they had this opportunity to do something about it by supporting Perot. So I think that was really the main contribution of Perot in the '92 campaign, is that he empowered a lot of people who had felt they had been left out of the process. And I think those people are still out there today.
Do you have any personal feelings about him?
Oh, well, yeah. I think everybody has personal feelings about him. But in what way?
I mean, do you like him politically?
Oh, yeah. I like him personally because I just think he's an interesting guy, fascinating guy. And he's sort of in the tradition of larger-than-life, mythical Texas politicians that I have grown up with and known and followed and covered. In some ways he's a lot like LBJ in that he wants to have control, and he wants to be powerful. And he also draws his sustenance from the people. But unlike LBJ, LBJ thought that government should do for people what they can't do for themselves. Perot feels that government should get out of the way and let the people do what they do best. But I think that it would be a mistake for him to be president. I don't think he'll ever be president. I don't think he wants to be president. I think he wanted to shake up the system. I think he wanted to wake people up to what's been going on in Washington. He wanted to get them involved. And I think he wanted to beat George Bush. I think those were his goals in '92.
Did you find out anything about the true nature of the relationship between Ross Perot and George Bush and what they...
What I suspect is that he and George Bush had some personal differences that had to do with, one had to do with a mission that Perot wanted to do to get the rest of the MIAs home. And this was when Bush was vice president. And Bush wouldn't go to bat for him, wouldn't help him with it. That, and I think that he also thought that Bush was more involved in Iran-Contra than he let on. And I think that he thought that Bush was not up to the job of being president, that he was smarter than Bush and that he was more capable than Bush. And just because of that, whether or not he wanted to be there and do it, he thought he ought to be because he thought he was a better guy.
Let's go back to the beginning. How did all this really start?
Well, it started really, I think, when Bush was out making Perot was out making speeches after Desert Storm, say in the fall of '91, and maybe even before then. He'd actually been on the speaking circuit for a good while, and everywhere he went to speak, you know, people would say, you know, you're right. What you're saying is right. You ought to be running for president. And people were trying to talk him into running.
What people?
Well, there was a guy, Jack Gargan in Florida, Throw the Rascals Out organization. There was a man in Tennessee who called him repeatedly and said, you know, you're our salvation. You've got to run. Just different people who would attend these events, hear him speak. And I think that's where it really started, and I think he had it in his mind. He had been urged to run before, even in 1988, and I talked with Tom Luce about that, and Luce said that he and Perot had several conversations about whether or not he ought to run for president.
By the way, what's the relationship between Tom Luce and Ross Perot today?
Well, I asked Luce about that. He won't talk about it. He won't talk about anything about really his relationship with Perot. He'll talk about the campaign. But I asked him if he was doing any business for Perot. You know, he's a lawyer. He's represented him for years. He's been his personal lawyer for years. And he said, well, he was doing business for Ross Jr., but that Ross Sr. is not doing any business right now, that his whole focus is on United We Stand, building up United We Stand as an organization, and he's not involved in business, so he said, therefore, I'm not doing any legal work for him. But I sense that he is not, that they're really not on, I'm sure they're talking, but not like they once did, I mean, which was every day or two. I doubt that they are doing very much conversation at all.
What happened?
I think one person said to me, a staffer said, who had known Perot for a long time and watched him over the years, said that Perot has a way of exhausting personal relationships. He has a way of exhausting people because he demands so much, he wants so much, and he takes so much from people. They get so, you know, emotionally involved in the work. I think that had a lot to do with it, and I think that Luce was disappointed, personally, very disappointed when Perot got out in July and left all of these people sort of holding the bag. I mean, these people who had put their lives on hold, who had, many of them were working, you know, 16-hour days for nothing. I mean, for no pay, to get this guy on the ballot and to make him president. And when he just like that got out without so much as a howdy-do to these people, I think that Luce felt that the same loss and the same anger that the people felt when he got out.
Go back again, though, to the earliest time. You have a scenario in here. It involves John J. Hooker.
Yeah, right. Now, he's the guy from Tennessee that I said.
John Siegenthaler and
yes.
the Nashville Tennessean. And you imply that he had said absolutely everything he said on the King Show in Tennessee, and it was printed in the, you didn't imply, you said it was, printed in the Tennessean before it ever happened nationally. Can you give us more on that? Yeah,
he went up to Nashville and to do a talk radio show, and some business leaders had a little reception for him there.
When was this?
This was, I believe, in January. of '92. It was before the Larry King Live show maybe it was early February. It was not long before the Larry King Live show. And he said something to the effect, the same thing that, you've got to get in the ring. If you get in the ring, put some skin in the game. I might do it. It was published, but in the Tennessean, but nobody else picked up on it. So I think John J. Hooker then talked to, who has been a businessman and a run for office in Tennessee, talked to Perot after that, and they they talked about venues on which, national venues, where Perot could go to get this message out that he would be available if people wanted him to do it. So it was no mistake, it was no coincidence that this happened on Larry King Live. I think they had decided that it would be Larry King Live. That was where he would throw his hat in the ring. And in so doing, he would appeal to a different, he would appeal to a different segment of the populace, people who watch these talk shows, where, he had already decided that that's where the future of communication is in electronic media. It's not in newspapers. He didn't want to go to the Wall Street Journal or to the LA Times or the New York Times or have just a regular press conference and do it. He wanted to do it a different way. And so they decided that he would go on Larry King Live. And I was told that it was Siegenthaler who called Larry King Live and said, if you press him, he might announce on your show. And that's exactly what happened.
And then, was he ready after that? Was he ready for a national effort?
Oh, no.
In reading your book, you keep hearing things like surprise on the part of his wife and his aides and
well,
others.
he didn't have anything in place. Now, a lot of people think, well, after he went on, he had his apparatus all in place there, ready to run a campaign. No, that was not true. He said then that he did not anticipate the reaction that he would get. He said, nothing will come of it. I said it, yes, I did it, but nothing will come of it. He told Sharon Holman that. He told his wife that. But then the phone started ringing off the hook. So that's when they started setting up the apparatus. It was not in place.
Who was the first group of people that he brought in? Who were they?
Well, the first group were people who worked in his, mainly came out of the Perot Group, which is a real estate company. And they were like marketing and financial people who'd never done anything in politics before, and they were just, winging it. And then he got Tom Luce involved fairly quickly. And
what about Mort Meyerson? When was he brought in, and who is he?
Mort Meyerson was the CEO of EDS when, at the time that General Motors bought EDS. So he had been sort of heading up Perot's business for a long time. He was not at the time that he came in to work at the campaign. He had retired. And he came in a little bit later on. I think the early ones were Tom Luce, and Luce brought in Jim Squires, the media guy, and he also brought in John P. White to do the issues development for Perot.
Did you talk to Jim Squires?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I talked at length to Jim Squires and also to John P. White. I eventually interviewed all of the people that were on my original list, by the way, after, since I guess my tenacity paid off.
Go back then to Jim Squires. What did you learn from him?
Well, I guess Jim Squires was interesting to me because he questioned the way we in the press cover presidential politics. And he was interested in Perot because he thought Perot had a chance to change the way we cover presidential politics. And I must say that I agree with him after having followed politics for a number of years myself. I think that the way that we cover presidential politics today, flying all these people around, all those reporters around, busing them from event to event, is silly and doesn't make a lot of sense and does not help the public dialogue. So I think that he was interested in seeing if Perot, by utilizing different forms of communication, could improve this public dialogue and change the way that we do this. I mean, I think the relationship today between the Washington Press Corps and the parties, the political leaders, may enable them to cover what's going on in Congress or in the White House or in Washington, but does not, there is no coverage of what the people think out there and what they want done. And this frantic flying around from place to place, just covering speech after speech, they don't ever talk to the people.
You live where?
In Dallas.
Full-time job?
Well, I'm the op-ed editor for the Dallas Morning News, and I write a political column. And I've been with the Dallas Morning News for 28 years.
Can somebody stamp a label on you? Are you a right-wing conservative,
no, no,
middle
no.
of the roader? Or?
No, I guess I'm pretty much a middle of the roader, and I'm a little more out of the old school politics, where I feel like that news reporters ought to be as objective as they can, and that they don't need to be crossing over into the realm of opinion writers. What I do now is I'm an opinion writer, but I guess I cut my teeth being a news reporter, and I think there's too much crossover now, where you're seeing that that the stories are they're called analysis, but there's a lot of opinion in stories today.
Where are you from originally? I'm
from Dallas.
Where'd you go to school?
I got my bachelor's degree from Texas Tech in journalism, and my master's degree in public affairs reporting from the University of Texas at Austin.
And where'd you go to work right out of school?
Well, I went to the Dallas Morning News, and I worked there briefly, and then I decided that I wanted to see the world and see what was going on somewhere elsewhere. So I went to Hawaii. I worked there for a while. Then I came up to Washington. I worked here, and then I went back and got my master's degree. And after that, actually, I came to Washington, and while I was in Washington, I really got interested in government and in politics. And so I went back to school to really study covering what I wanted to do. I decided was cover governmental bodies and government and politics in some way. So I went back and got my master's degree in that. After that, I went back to the Morning News, got married, and I've been there ever since.
You say in your book that Mr. Perot didn't visit your own paper during this campaign. Did that make you mad?
Well, yeah, we were a little miffed by that, because, you know, we invited him. We wanted to have an editorial board with him, and he wouldn't come in. In fact, he never had a sit-down interview, I don't think, with any of our reporters. But he would, he pretty much ignored us. But, you know, he ignored most of the print press as best as he could.
What was your relationship with him before and after? In other words, as a paper, did you take an editorial stance in the campaign?
Yes, we supported George Bush. Mm-hmm.
Any equivocation there, or was it solid 100% support?
Yeah, we supported Bill Clinton in the primary, in the Democratic primary. We supported George Bush in the primary. We supported George Bush in the general election. We had some editorials that pointed out the good things that we thought that Perot was doing in the political arena. The fact that he was finding new ways to communicate with people, and that he was utilizing the communications revolution in new and different ways, and that the fact that he was energizing people to get involved in politics, we thought was a good thing.
Go back to Jim Squires. What's his relationship to Mr. Perot today?
As far as I know, they're still very good friends, and in fact, Jim Squires did work for Perot in the fall campaign, although he wasn't in Dallas. He was at his horse farm in Kentucky, but he did some consultant work, and they called him from time to time and asked his advice and his opinion.
Jim Squires, Mort Meyerson, Tom Luce, and then came who else to the campaign?
Well, of course, the biggie was Ed Rollins and Ham Jordan when they were hired around the 1st of June. Ham Jordan actually had been sort of a voluntary advisor through the spring. He had talked with Luce, and he was very interested in the grassroots movement and what Perot was doing to reconnect with the grassroots, and was interested in he saw, I think, a lot of what's wrong with politics today, It's been taken over by the consultants and the professionals and so forth, and he was interested in seeing if people could get involved in. So he was he counseled with Luce on this non-conventional campaign. So Jordan was sort of involved, and then they got John P. White involved, who was the to develop the issues, and John P. White had worked in the Carter administration. So you had sort of two Democrats there, and Mort Meyerson and Luce thought, well, we probably should get a Republican to, because at that time, in fact, throughout the campaign, Perot was appealing to both Republicans and Democrats and to independents as well. So to keep, I guess, the level playing field, they thought, well, they should, if they were going to bring in a consultant, they should bring in a Republican consultant as well. And the reason that they thought that they needed to bring those consultants in was that the thing had just grown like topsy. And it was very sort of chaotic, and particularly when Mort Meyerson came in, who was used to the business world and used to things being more orderly. He said, we need to do something about this chaos. And so they hired Ham Jordan and Ed Rollins then to come in and sort of take the campaign from the point of being just a petition drive into being a real live presidential campaign. And that was, as I write in the book, was really the beginning of the undoing of the Perot campaign.
Why?
Well, I think the big problem was Rollins. Rollins came in, he brought 30 or 40 professionals in with him very quickly. The professionals took over the campaign. It was no longer the unconventional campaign that Perot had said he wanted in the beginning. So it became the kind of campaign that Perot had said in the beginning he abhorred, that he wasn't going to run with all the manipulation and the spin and so forth and so on. That was a problem. And then Perot didn't get along with Rollins at all. I mean, it was the clash of the giant egos. And
you point out something I wanted to ask you about, that that Mr. Perot drives his own car, and that right away Ed Rollins got a limousine or a car and a driver. And
yeah, Rollins came in, and he was the one who had a driver. He was the one who had, aides who would fetch his cleaning and do this and do that. And Perot it's not his style. Perot drives his own car. He goes, he sits in line in the barber shop to get his $8 haircut. It just was not his style.
How did you pick up the fact that Mr. Rollins had his own driver and all?
Oh, they were all talking about it out there at the campaign headquarters, and the tensions developed within the campaign. You would have thought, well, their tensions would have developed because you have one Democrat consultant, then you have one Republican consultant, but the tensions were really between the volunteers and the professionals. And the volunteers who were working in the phone bank there in Dallas resented the fact that all these professionals had come in, and they were behind locked doors there doing God knows what. And while they were trying to keep up the grassroots movement, you had these professionals over here running, trying to put together, the slicker professional campaign.
When was the first time that you found that the system was breaking down between Ross Perot and Ed Rollins? And what did Ham Jordan do in that mix?
Well, not long after the professionals came on board, things started breaking down. I mean, the height of the Perot mania was actually about early June, at the time of the California primary. You recall that the exit polls in California said if Perot had been on the ballot, he would have won both primaries out there. That was really the height. The pros came in. About that time, the press is also starting to focus on Perot's business dealings, on his family, anything that they can find, because he didn't have a political record to focus on. So he's beginning to really take some hits in the media. The pros come in, they don't mix well with the volunteers, and all of a sudden things start just sliding downhill. And I think it starts about late June of '92, things really started falling apart.
What's the relationship between Ham Jordan and Ross Perot today?
Well, I don't think there is any relationship, although Perot sort of blames Rollins. In fact, I asked him what, he doesn't really blame Jordan for what happened. He does blame Rollins. I asked him if there was anything he would have done differently. And he said, well, he doesn't, you know, ordinary, he doesn't like to look back, but he said bringing in the pros was a mistake. And he said, I'm not talking about Ham or Squires, but the others. And so specifically he meant Rollins. And Rollins, they got into a real knockdown drag-out over advertising and spending a lot of money on advertising. Rollins wanted to use Hal Riney, who had produced the Morning in America ads for Ronald Reagan. And once again, that just wasn't Perot style. Perot had already decided that what he wanted to do was just Ross Perot in front of the cameras with his charts and his pie charts and his graphs, and he didn't want that sort of a slick Morning in America style advertising campaign. Plus, he didn't want to spend his money doing that.
You said that Ham Jordan was paid $75,000 a month during the time that he was there? Mm-hmm. How did you find that out? It's
in the FEC records.
Was it that same amount of money paid to Ed Rollins?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How does that track with money that you know is paid to consultants?
Well, it's pretty highly paid for consultants, I guess, but Rollins said, you know, he was just making what he would have made had he stayed in business in Washington, which I guess was $800,000 and $900,000 a year. So it's pretty highly paid, I guess.
At one point in the book, you say that he meaning Ross Perot, thought the TV folks loved him.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Didn't they?
Well, they did early on, I think. You know, he could pick up the phone and call almost any network show, you know, and get on because he was a good draw. He commanded an audience. And so I think they did love him early on, and until they started wanting more specifics, and he was not more forthcoming with specifics. Now, I think that some of the shows ridiculed him from the very beginning. Some of the Sunday morning talk shows did not treat him as well as, say, Talk TV, the Larry King shows, and the call-in shows, and so forth.
You say that as long as he was just a blip on the radar screen, the press collectively would let Perot have his fun. But when it became apparent that he was a serious candidate, that he had the potential to scramble not just the presidential race, but the whole political system, it was time to take a closer look. Mm-hmm. When did that happen?
I'd say that was probably around early June, late May, early June of '92.
Then what happened?
Well, as one reporter from Newsweek said to me, the press resented the fact that he had not gone through the primary. They had not had the opportunity to ask him questions that they normally would ask of candidates. And a reporter from Newsweek said to me, there was a collective feeling among the press that we had to put him through a primary. And so that was what they did. We did.
When the print press then started writing the stories, what then happened to him? Mm-hmm. How did he personally react to it?
He went ballistic. He never envisioned that he would have the kind of press scrutiny that he got. And Tom Luce never envisioned it. At one point in June, there were 11 New York Times reporters in Dallas working on stories on Perot. He never envisioned that they would be looking at his family, that they would be looking at looking at all of his business dealings like they did. So he, a lot of people have said he was thin-skinned, and I guess he was. He could not take it when the media started tearing down the image that he had spent a lifetime developing. I mean, the way he sees himself and the way the media was picturing were two totally different stories. For example, after the NAACP speech, he had always pictured himself as a great humanitarian. All of a sudden, he's being pictured as a racist. I mean, he just couldn't, those two things just couldn't jive in his mind. And I think that was one of the main reasons, if not the reason, that he got out of the race in July, that he could not take the ruination of this image that he had spent a lifetime developing.
Was there a particular story?
No, I don't think there was one story. I think there were many stories that bothered him, and then there were the threat of more stories. And of course, therein came, the threat of stories the threat that his daughter's wedding was going to be disrupted, and that was part of it. The fact that that the campaign had become the kind of campaign that he didn't want to run. I think those were all factors in the decision that he made to get out.
Does he ever call a group of aides together in his office and say, let's talk about the future?
I doubt it. He is not one to seek or listen to advice, and that's probably one of Perot's weaknesses. And John White said, in fact, he brought in all of these graduate students, public policy students, to work on issues for Perot, and they developed these big issues books. And John White thought, well, at some point we'll take the issues books in and we'll go through these one by one with Perot and decide what his positions are. Perot really didn't want to fool with all that. He basically wanted an economic plan, and so he never really developed a full platform like most candidates would. He only developed this economic plan. He said, let's focus on that, let's get one thing right, and let's do that, and so that's what they did.
Who writes these books that he puts out?
Basically, let's see, the first book was written by largely, well, the first draft was written by a writer named Wick Allison, who came into Dallas, and he actually was originally from Dallas, was a magazine publisher in Dallas years ago. He came in and was to write this book, issues book, the first book, over a period of 3 weeks. And what he did was he took all of Perot's speeches, he took the issues papers and positions that the issues team had worked up and worked it into a book. It was then rewritten after that by Squires and by John White, and then Perot rewrote the final draft, the final book.
What about his book on NAFTA?
Well, that was largely written by Choate, although Choate said that that Perot certainly was a co-author on that book, that he was very actively involved. It wasn't like Choate drafted the book and gave it to Perot. He used Perot's speeches as well in putting it together, and Perot did, contribute to that as well.
If he were to call into his office the top people around him who he could talk over his future with, who would they be today?
Mort Meyerson is really is running Perot systems for him today, and he's really, I guess, the only guy who could really talk straight back to Perot that I know of. He has, a number of people who run in the United We Stand organization, but he just he walks to his own drum.
Did he really come close to firing his son?
Well, he did for a period of time there, because actually Ross Jr. was not working for the campaign full time anyway. I mean, he's running his business, but he was an advisor, because he's good friends with his dad. When Ed Rollins persuaded Ross Jr. to go to his father and make the case to keep Hal Riney, the ad man that Perot didn't want, Perot Sr., got mad and said, there you are carrying water for the Pentagon. That's what he called the professionals that had come in. He called them the Pentagon. And he said, you're out of this campaign, out of here. And so he was out for a while, but eventually, he was certainly very much a part of the fall campaign and was one of his advisors in the fall, as was his son-in-law, Clay Mulford.
What ever happened to Orson Swindle?
Well, Orson, who was the first director of the original United We Stand, is now working for Empower America, And what happened after the election, they were talking what to do about United We Stand. Orson Swindle had a different vision of what United We Stand should be from what Perot thought. He wanted. He said he thought that it should have more intellectual. There should be others feeding ideas and information to United We Stand besides Ross Perot. And he wanted it to be a Washington outfit that would be up here trying to get legislation, trying to change the face of Congress, putting out new ideas. Perot wanted it to be a Dallas-based organization, and he wanted to be the one pretty much setting the agenda. So they're still good friends today. Swindle thinks that Perot did a lot for the process, but he decided to go back to the Republican Party and to try to work for solutions within the two-party system and to work for Empower America, where he felt that there was more intellectual muscle because it had Gene Kirkpatrick, Jack Kemp, and William Bennett, as well as others.
In your thank you list, you just have a name I've got to ask you about, Willie Nelson.
Oh.
Is that the same Willie Nelson that's the entertainer?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Why is he on this list?
Well, he was an early supporter of Perot. As a matter of fact, he appeared at a rally with Perot in Little Rock, and I guess it was May. I can't remember exactly when it was, and he was on stage with Perot, and I interviewed him there, and so I list everybody that I interviewed.
You list Gordon Black, the pollster, and I remember we covered an event that Gordon Black was releasing a poll basically that said that Perot was the future. Are they still together?
I don't know, but I suspect that they are, although I don't think that Gordon Black has done any work for Perot since in the spring. But I first came across Gordon Black's name in California in June, and some volunteers out there told me about Gordon Black, that he had done a study that spring which showed that there was greater support for a third-party movement at that particular time than any time in history, any time since the beginning of the Republican Party. He found that there was greater anger among the electorate, greater dissatisfaction than any time since the beginning of polling in the 30s. And I talked with him shortly before the book went to the press, a year later, I guess in June of this year, of '93. And he said that he was continuing to do polling on the same subject, and he was finding the same alienation still exists, the same anger is still out there. That there still is a core support for a third party of about a third of the populace.
Why won't Ross Perot, at least as of this taping, release the amount of money he has collected for United We Stand America, or tell us how many members he's got in it?
Well, once again, that's just Perot. He told me that when the organization was totally organized, United We Stand, in 50 states, that which he expected would be by the end of 1992, by the end of 1993, that he would release the number of members.
Do you have any reason why he wouldn't, as we go, when he's asked that question so often, answer that question?
No. I think that is just the way he operates, that he likes to keep things close to the vest, and he wants to keep it secret. Maybe it's not as many members as he thought that he should have. I don't know, but I think that's a mistake that he makes, that he is not more open about such things, because I think that harms the credibility of his organization, that he doesn't. I mean, from time to time, he could just make a periodic report. You know, we have so many members now.
Let me read you a line from your book. You're talking about some of the findings of Frank Luntz, who was also a pollster. Now, do you know what their relationship is today?
Well, Frank Luntz has gone back to, he came in and did some polling in the summer of '92 for Perot. And he is now back. He originally came out of the Republican camp, and he's now back doing polling for Republicans and doing work for the Republicans.
This is what you say. One of his most interesting findings was that not once did a Perot supporter identify himself as a liberal or conservative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he said it shows, you know, that ideology was not what Perotism was all about. In fact, I think that probably he also found that that the Perot support was a large chunk of his support came out of the Reagan coalition. So you would think, well, they are pretty much basically conservative, and I think that they are, but they are more pragmatists, like Perot himself. They are concerned about fixing what's wrong with the economy and the government. So basically, they are interested in economic and governmental reforms and changes, but they are not ideologues. Most of them really don't want, you know, social issues involved in the political process. They're not really that interested. For example, abortion, they think should be left out. They're interested in the economy, the budget, trade, those governmental reform, those kinds of issues.
Your book was finished on what date?
It was finished about some date in June of '92.
93.
93, sorry, yeah.
As you watched then from June of 1993 through the NAFTA debate,
yeah.
Did you ever say, oh, I wish I still had a chapter to write, and would it made any difference to your book?
No, I don't think things have changed appreciably since June of '93. I think that Perot's personal popularity may have gone down somewhat as a result of the NAFTA debate. But I don't think that there has been an appreciable change in the movement that remains out there, because I think that the whole thing to me is about more than just Ross Perot, and I think that the mainstream media missed a lot of the story in '92 by focusing on Perot as a personality and looking at the people who follow him as a personality cult. I think that these people that are supporting Perot, who are members of United We Stand today, are in this more for the long haul, that he has created a stable political force of the alienated middle class, independents, who are not in transition between the two parties. They weren't in June of '93, and they're not today. And just because he may have lost some personal popularity in the NAFTA debate does not mean that their interest has been diminished. I think that they are continuing to hold themselves out there as sort of a hammer or leverage for the future to try to change the face of Congress and get some of these governmental and economic reforms through.
Anybody that reads your book will find a lot of quotes from a lot of people across the media spectrum. How did you go about doing that?
The media quotes?
Yeah.
A lot of that came from the Political Hotline that's published here in Washington, which daily issues a report of what is said in all the newspapers and on all the TV shows on the day before on the campaign or in politics. A lot of it came from the hotline, and then a lot of it just came from the Dallas Morning News I used as a primary source, New York Times I used as a primary source, and other newspapers like, you know, Wall Street Journal.
The Summit Group published this book for you. Where's that?
It's in Fort Worth.
And when you first had the idea for the book, where did you take it? Did you take it to the Summit Group?
No, of course, I took it to New York. I got an agent in New York to try to sell the book, and this was in the spring of '92, and New York was very skeptical of Ross Perot. They thought that he was a short-term phenomenon, and in fact, they thought he'd be gone by the fall. So she shopped my proposal around to several publishers and came back and said to me, they want to know, can you do a sassy book? And I said, well, that's not exactly what I had in mind. And then she said, well, can you do an investigative book? Can you do a Perot bashing book? I said, that's not what I had in mind either. What I saw was a legitimate political movement that I thought should be chronicled as objectively as possible by a impartial third party. And so that was the kind of book I wanted to write. They didn't want to buy it. So I didn't have a publisher. When Perot got out of the race, I had spent 3 months interviewing all these people and going to the rallies and so forth, and but I didn't have a publisher. So when he got out of the race in July, I just packed up all of my research and put it away. And I thought, well, it's over with. And I didn't do anything else about the book until after the election. And when 19.7 million voters voted for Perot, 19%, which was the greatest of any independent or third-party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, I thought there's still something extraordinary going on out in the country that the other politicians are not picking up on. So I decided to get my boxes out and go back to it. So I didn't go back to New York after that. I thought I need a different kind of a publisher to publish the kind of book that I want to write. So I was looking for a small commercial house, or if that didn't work, I was going to go for an academic publisher. And the first one on my list happened to be the Summit Group. And I didn't have an agent at that time. I just decided I would see if I could sell it myself. I was looking at some small commercial houses that specialized in books on politics and government. And it just happened the Summit Group was in Fort Worth, and I knew that at one point they were interested in a Perot book before he had gotten out of the race. So I contacted them and showed them the first 2 or 3 chapters, what I had written at that time, and my proposal. And they said, how soon can you get it to us?
But they, and clear this up, in other words, a publisher says to you, can you do a sassy book, or can you do an investigative negative book? That's the way they want you to go after a project like this?
Well, that was the feedback I got from the agent that I had in New York, who was shopping the book around to the publishing houses. They felt like the only kind of book that would sell, I guess, was one that was either sassy in tone or one that was an investigative book.
What about the Summit Group? Did they ever want you to doctor this book up to sell better?
No. They were perfectly happy with this kind of book. This was the kind of book that they wanted to sell. And I guess, a smaller commercial house has a little bit more flexibility, and they don't have to sell as many books as a big New York publishing house.
Do you know what the first printing, how many books?
It's 30,000.
How's it doing?
Doing very well, yeah. Yeah, we're very pleased.
Now, I noticed just around the Washington area that a lot of the bookstores have this book in it, published by a small publisher. How do they distribute a book like this?
Well, it's distributed by national distributors, by whoever these companies are that are national distributors.
Is this your first book?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
If you had it to do over again, would you do anything different?
Probably not.
What did you think of the whole experience?
It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot, and it was very rewarding. I enjoyed it.
What was the toughest part of it?
The toughest part is right now. The toughest part was not writing it. The toughest part now is promoting it.
Why is that tough?
I don't know. It just, it's just, it's harder than writing it.
Did you expect that part to be tough?
No, I didn't expect to be doing it, to tell you the truth. I just thought, well, I'd write the book and put it out there if anybody wanted to buy it. Well, they could. But
what would somebody get in this book that they might not know about Ross Perot? What would be the value of having this book from what you've seen and what you know that's in it?
Well, I think it pulls it all together, that a lot of people read a lot of stories, here, there, and yon about Ross Perot, and they continue to see the focus on the personality of Perot. I just think this book pulls it all together and shows why Perot was an attractive candidate, why he was a viable candidate, a credible candidate to a lot of people, and why they're still involved today.
Can somebody, in your opinion, duplicate what he's done in the future?
That is an interesting question. They ought to be able to. I think he has paved the way for it. But there's no question that it was a unique combination of a time and a man that produced him in '92 as a credible candidate.
How much did the billions, the $3 billion that he's got, play in this thing?
Oh, it was enormous.
I mean, if you didn't have that money, could you do it?
I don't think so, but Tom Luce thinks that anybody who has the ability to go on the talk shows and to have the kind of media appeal that Perot had could do it. I mean, somebody like Ted Turner or Bill Cosby or anybody like that. I don't think so. I think that Perot got credibility originally because he had the money, that he could spend as much money as he wanted. And so that gave him instant credibility. And that's primarily why people were willing to talk to him and have him come on their shows. But then the force of his personality then, of course, took over. And he was sort of a media star there for a while.
Have you gotten any feedback from the Perot organization or Mr. Perot himself about your book?
Well, from the organization, yes, they are. Sharon Holman, for example, was pleased with it and glad that somebody had written a book about really about the grassroots campaign. And I've had several inquiries from United We Stand people across the country of how they can get supply of the book because their people would like to have it.
By the way, and we're about out of time, where did this cover come from?
The cover was commissioned by the Summit Group. An artist in Wichita Falls did that.
That's
I'm sorry, I
book.
don't know his name.
Perot and His People, Disrupting the Balance of Power by Carolyn Barta. We thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.